have always struggled in what is said to be a man's world, but our greatest struggle yet has been inequality towards women. In 1848, a few women decided to pave the way for change. July 13th, 1848 marked the beginning of the women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a concerned housewife and mother, was invited to tea with 4 women friends. Stanton expressed her outrage with the limitations placed on women. Stanton's friends agreed with her. Within 2 days of having tea together, these daring women had planned the first Women's Rights Convention. They had picked a date, location, and placed an announcement in the Seneca Falls newspaper, titled, "A Convention to Discuss the Social, Civil, and Religious Condition and Rights of Women." The gathering was to take place on July 19th and 20th, 1848. During this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which used the Declaration of Independence as its reference point. She added specifics on how women were being oppressed and treated unjustly. Newspaper editors were shocked by the points made in the Declaration of Sentiments, and the fact that women were demanding the vote set off attacks and ridicule to all who participated in the convention. This, however, helped bring positive recognition to the movement as well, and people in other cities and isolated towns joined in great numbers. In 1849, The Lily, the first newspaper edited by and for women, was published by Amelia Jenks Bloomer. The Lily went through changes over the years on its views. In 1850, The Lily was describing itself as devoted to the interests of women, and by 1852 it was dedicated to the emancipation of women from intemperance, injustice, prejudice, and bigotry. This was then later followed by other newspapers such as The Genius of Liberty, The Pioneer, The Woman's Advocate, and later The Revolution, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony themselves. The Second Women's Rights Convention, October 1850, was thought by many to have marked the beginning of the journey towards women's equality. While Seneca Falls was the first convention, it was a local convention. The Worcester Convention brought delegates from most of the northern states. 100 people from 11 states attended, spreading word of the cause. Sojourner Truth, a former slave and anti-slavery supporter, became a part of the women's suffrage movement in the 1850s. She was famous for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" which screams out to the injustice not only against white women but to all women, shedding light on her horrible experiences as a slave and black woman in the South. She spoke of the power of women and how men should allow them to fight for what is rightfully theirs.
From slavery in 1827 speaks to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles, or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. Well, what's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man there in the black, he says women can't have much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it. The men better let them.
Susan B. Anthony, a long-standing member of the Sisters of Temperance, along with Antoinette Brown, is not allowed to speak at the World Temperance Convention in New York City. They were shouted down by a hostile audience and expelled from the convention. In 1854, Massachusetts legislature gives property rights to women. The same year, the Fifth Women's Rights Convention is held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This convention combined both male and female leadership and was focused on career opportunities, equal wages, expanded education, property rights for women, marriage reform, and of course the ongoing struggle for women's suffrage. With the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, women were forced into public life in ways that they never would have imagined. Thousands of women in both the North and the South joined volunteer bridges and signed up to work as nurses. They provided food for soldiers, sewed and laundered uniforms, knitted gloves, socks, and organized door-to-door fundraising campaigns to raise money for medical supplies and other necessities. It was the first time in history that women had played a significant role in war. It is said that more than 400 women disguised themselves as men and fought in the Union and Confederate armies. 1866 was the first National Women's Rights Convention since the war, and a new group forms called the American Equal Rights Association. This same year, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a petition for universal suffrage. She wanted for all women to be included in the 15th Amendment, not just men of color. In 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony start the circulation of the Revolution. The Revolution was a weekly newspaper written for women and suffragists. The American Equal Rights Association is in disagreement over whether or not to support the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment would grant the right to vote to colored males. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony found the National Women's Suffrage Association. The National Women's Suffrage Association was more radical and wanted to achieve the vote through a constitutional amendment. They also pushed for other women's rights issues as well as suffrage. At the time, it would still be years before women were allowed to vote, but even today we struggle for equality in every way possible. Through our strength and unity, we will overcome any obstacle.